Newman completed his response to Gladstone after a month's continuous writing, and the pamphlet, which was actually 150 pages of close print, was published on the 14th of January, 1875. So this is the context in which Newman was writing. The question was whether Catholics could be loyal subjects or whether they could now be discounted as loyal subjects. The secular understanding of conscience, which has affected many Catholics, at least in the secularized West, is that conscience is something that is personal to oneself. Now, of course, it is perfectly true, just as I can only think with my own mind and not somebody else's, so too I can only follow or not follow my own conscience, not somebody else's. But when people today speak of my conscience, with the emphasis on my, they are thinking of the conscience as something a good deal more individual and personal than that. This is the kind of typical secular person in today's Western world. It is like speaking of my personality or my likes and dislikes. In authoritarian cultures and societies, of course, the opposite may happen. My conscience becomes the conscience of the state. As Goebbels, wasn't it, said, my conscience is Adolf Hitler. And even in a secular pluralist society, the individual may equate law with morality. If the state permits same-sex unions and outlaws any form of discrimination, then the citizen may feel it is not homosexuality that is immoral, but its condemnation. And it is certainly possible for Catholics, too, to equate their conscience with the teaching of the Church, which is not the same thing as conscientiously obeying the teaching of the Church. In his celebrated treatment of conscience, then, in the letter to the Duke of Norfolk, Newman follows the Catholic tradition by avoiding both extremes. That is, by emphasizing both the rights and the duties of conscience. For while conscience is personal to the person, conscience implies an authority outside the person. Newman begins by quoting St. Thomas Aquinas' definition of the natural law as an impression of the divine light in us, a participation of the eternal law in the rational creature. It is the human awareness of this law, however faulty this awareness may be in individual cases, hence Newman's emphasis on the echo rather than the actual voice, that Newman defines as conscience. This law, as apprehended in the minds of individual men, is called conscience, and though it may suffer refraction in passing into the intellectual medium of each, it is not therefore so affected as to lose its character of being the divine law, but still has as such the prerogative of commanding obedience. Conscience, therefore, does not belong to me like my personality, but nevertheless, even when it is in error, I have a duty to follow its dictates. The modern secular idea of conscience, says Newman, is that it is a creation of man, nothing more than a long-sighted selfishness. And this is a characteristically penetrating observation by Newman, a desire to be consistent with oneself. Newman restates the traditional Catholic concept of conscience as sovereign but dependent on an external authority. Conscience, he writes, is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. The allusion to the Pope, of course, is clear there. The aboriginal conscience. Aboriginal vicar of Christ, a prophet in its informations, a monarch in its peremptoriness, a priest in its blessings and anathemas, and even though the eternal priesthood throughout the Church would cease to be, in it the sacerdotal principle would remain and would have a sway. This stern monitor has been replaced in a secularized society, writes Newman, by a counterfeit, namely the right of thinking, speaking, writing, acting according to their judgment or their humor without any thought of God at all. In other words, by what is nothing more than the right of self-will. Conscience then becomes simply the very right and freedom of conscience to dispense with conscience. Stinging words from Newman. In his essay In Aid of a Grammar of Assent, Newman had spoken of conscience as a voice or the echo of a voice, imperative and constraining, as I already quoted. And the modification, of course, of the echo is important, as I've already said. But because we only hear an echo, says Newman, this is why we need the Church, whose mission it is to proclaim the moral law and to protect and strengthen it. It's the supply, it's very Newmanian, it's the supply of an urgent demand. Newman next turns to answer the objection that it is the existence of such an infallible authority as the Church, as that of the Church, the papacy, that threatens the very sovereignty of conscience. He begins by laying down that conscience is not a judgment upon any speculative truth, any abstract doctrine, but bears immediately on conduct, on something to be done or not done. Because conscience is concerned with what must be done or not done here and now, conscience cannot come into direct collision with the Church's or the Pope's infallibility, which is engaged on general propositions and in the condemnation of particular and given errors. Newman concludes, conscience being a practical dictate, a collision is possible between it and the Pope's authority only when the Pope legislates or gives particular orders and the like. But a Pope is not infallible in his laws, nor in his commands, nor in his acts of state, nor in his administration, nor in his public policy. Newman then discusses the possibility of disobeying a papal edict or order, which he allows for, but for which he lays down very stringent conditions. If in a particular case conscience is to be taken as a sacred and sovereign monitor, its dictate, in order to prevail against the voice of the Pope, must follow upon serious thought, prayer, and all available means of arriving at a right judgment on the matter in question. And further, obedience to the Pope is what is called in possession. That is, the onus probandi of establishing a case against him lies, as in all cases of exception, on the side of conscience. Unless a man is able to say to himself, as in the presence of God, that he must not and dare not act upon the papal injunction, he is bound to obey it and commit a great sin in disobeying it. Now, it's often claimed today that Newman allowed for conscientious dissent from church teachings. The fact is, he did not. He only allowed for disobedience to orders. And the celebrated toast at the end of the letter to the Duke of Norfolk concerns papal orders, not teachings. This is, of course, one of the commonest misunderstandings of Newman. And again, we have to remind ourselves of the context in which he's writing. Gladstone wasn't questioning any teachings of the Pope, apart from the infallibility. I mean, it wasn't any moral teachings. What Gladstone, of course, was questioning, was implying also, more than implying, was that the Pope now had total authority over the individual's conscience. So I'm sure you all know this famous sentence, which has been so often misused and misunderstood. Certainly, if I'm obliged to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, which indeed does not seem quite the thing, I shall drink to the Pope, if you please, still to conscience first, and the Pope afterwards. And those words have given a great deal of trouble, brought Newman a great deal of trouble for Newman. Now, Newman was concerned with the charge that by virtue of the definition of papal infallibility, Catholics could no longer be regarded as loyal, law-abiding citizens, since they were now subject to papal decrees and orders, which they were bound to obey, however immoral they might be. Although it is true that Newman did, in accordance with the Catholic tradition, hold that conscience is indeed supreme in the sense that it is, to use his own evocative phrase, the aboriginal vicar of Christ, this famous toast was never intended by Newman to mean that a Catholic may be led by his or her conscience to dissent from church teachings. Of course, he would agree with St. Thomas Aquinas that a Catholic may, indeed should, follow an erroneous conscience, even if it means leaving the church. But a believing member of the church has a conscientious duty to believe the teachings of the church, not to pick and choose what to believe. The truth is that Newman was primarily concerned in the letter to the Duke of Norfolk to refute Gladstone's charge that the First Vatican Council's definition of papal infallibility deprived Catholics of their political freedom and made them subjects to a foreign power, that is, the Holy See, and to show the definition did nothing to subvert their patriotism or diminish their moral responsibility. The idea that a Catholic could conscientiously dissent from the magisterium's moral teachings would have amazed Newman. The possibility never occurred to him. Writing before the ethical issues raised by advances in medical knowledge, he could write without batting an eyelid. So little does the Pope come into this whole system of moral theology, by which, as by our conscience, our lives are regulated, that the weight of his hand upon us as private men is absolutely unappreciable. Indeed, he adds, if my account be correct, I do not see what he takes away at all from our private conscience. With blissful lack of prescience, Newman observes that the field of morals contains so little that is unknown and unexplored, in contrast with revelation and doctrinal fact, that it is difficult to see what portions of moral teaching in the course of 1800 years actually have proceeded from the Pope or from the Church, where, of course, we live in very different times. Nevertheless, what Newman has to say about conscience and its relation to the teaching church is still relevant. Whenever anyone uses their conscience to make a judgment about what should or should not be done here and now, that person, if he or she is making a conscientious judgment, will be applying whatever general moral principles they happen to hold. In the case of a Catholic, then, their conscience will be making a judgment in the light of the moral teachings of the Church. Now, in the case of affirmative or positive teaching, such as the need to give generously to the poor from what one has, each person obviously has to make a conscientious judgment as what that means for that particular person. No pope or bishop or priest can decide that. All they can do is to enunciate the general principle and urge that it be conscientiously put into practice. But what of negative teachings, such as it is always wrong to have an abortion, or always wrong to wage indiscriminate warfare? Might it not be argued in the case of these absolute negative teachings that do not admit of exceptions, there is no room for the individual Catholic conscience to make a practical judgment, and that the only judgment a Catholic can make in these circumstances is to follow an erroneous conscience and disobey the Church's teachings? In this case, there would indeed be a direct collision between the individual Catholic conscience and the Church's teaching authority, pacing Newman. So Newman would be wrong. But in such a case, Newman would say that such an erroneous conscience was no longer a Catholic conscience, and because it rejected a general teaching of the Church, such a conscience could indeed come into direct conflict with the Church. So he'd allow for that, of course. But what of a faithful Catholic conscience in relation to absolute negative moral teachings? Has such a conscience any practical judgment to make except to obey the particular teaching? I think that Newman would respond in two ways. First, is it in fact possible so to frame such a teaching as to exclude all possible exceptions? To take a simple, obvious example, the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," only applies to deliberate wrongful killing. If I'm driving in an urban area at the correct speed and a child jumps out in front of my car and is killed, I'm not guilty either of murder or of manslaughter. The fault, if there is one, lies with the child, not with me. Alternatively, the Church's tradition considers it permissible to kill deliberately in self-defense or in a just war, for such killing is deliberate but not wrongful. But what if we move from such a very general teaching to much more specific teachings, such as it is always wrong to wage warfare indiscriminately against whole cities, Second Vatican Council in the Pastoral Constitution on the Modern World, or it is always wrong to practice contraception? Surely to these much tighter teachings there can be no exceptions. But even here, the conscientious Catholic has to use their conscience. A Catholic pilot on a bombing mission, say in Afghanistan or that was in Iraq, has to decide whether the instructions he has been given, if carried out, would constitute indiscriminate warfare against a whole city. And obviously he can't ring up the Vatican to ask. If the alleged strategic targets are so vague or so indirectly connected with any military purpose, then he may conclude that that would be the case. And I think a British Catholic bomber during the Second World War who bombed the German cities would indeed face a great crisis of conscience where he wasn't bombing oil installations but deliberately bombing innocent civilians. On the other hand, if the pilot considers the strategic targets are sufficiently defined and it is possible to attack them without at the same time directly attacking the civilian population, he would be